Imagine you poured $1.3 billion into a brand new port, won the right to run it for 30 years, and were told you'd control the busiest gateway between Asia and South America. Then, with the project almost finished, the government suddenly cancels your contract. That's the drama at the heart of Chancay. Here's the quick picture. A Chinese consortium took a 60% stake in the port of Chancay, poured in cash and cranes, and built deep berths able to host ultra-large container ships. For shippers, Chancay promised to be a shortcut, cutting ocean time by days and saving millions in tolls and fuel every year. For Peru, it promised jobs, billions in revenue, and a chance to become a regional logistics hub. For China, it was a strategic foothold in South America, the sort of big infrastructure win that reshapes trade routes. So what happened? Midway through construction, Peruvian officials suddenly questioned the deal, raised national security concerns, and moved to revoke the exclusive operating rights. The move looked like a total collapse, legal battles, headlines, and a pause on a near-completed mega-project. For a moment, it seemed like geopolitics had torn up a contract and stalled a major economic opportunity. But the story doesn't stop at the cancellation. Diplomacy and politics soon re-entered the frame, and what followed flipped the script again. In the next section, we'll go back to where the whole thing started, the 2019 deal, the Belt and Road context, and why both sides thought Chancay was worth betting on. Back in 2011, Peru had a bold idea: to build a modern deep-water port on its central coast, something that could finally connect South America directly to Asia. For years, it was just a dream: studies, proposals, endless paperwork. Then, in 2019, everything changed. That's when a powerful new player stepped in: COSCO Shipping Ports, one of China's largest state-owned logistics giants. COSCO didn't just offer to help. It bought a 60% stake in the Chancay project and pledged a staggering $1.3 billion investment to turn this quiet fishing town into a world-class port. The remaining 40% was held by Peru's mining company, Volcan, which saw Chancay as a vital export route for copper and minerals. For Peru, this partnership was a game-changer. China wasn't just sending money, it was sending engineers, cranes, and entire construction teams. The project promised tens of thousands of local jobs and a new trade hub capable of handling 1 million containers a year, directly linking South America with Shanghai, Shenzhen, and other major Chinese ports. In less than 2 years, COSCO transformed Chancay from an empty coastline into a mega construction site. Massive tunnels were carved under hills to connect the docks to inland highways. Concrete giants rose from the Pacific. Local news even dubbed it the Panama Canal of the Pacific. But behind the excitement, something deeper was unfolding. This wasn't just a port. It was part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing's global strategy to reshape trade routes and expand influence through infrastructure. For China, Chancay wasn't about Peru alone. It was about anchoring its presence in Latin America, securing supply chains for raw materials, and reducing dependence on U.S.-controlled shipping routes. For Peru, it looked like a once-in-a-generation leap forward, a chance to become the gateway between South America and Asia. No one knew that just a few years later, this dream project would run into a political storm that could threaten everything China built. By early 2024, Chancay was almost ready. The cranes were up, the terminals were taking shape, and COSCO had already spent more than $1 billion turning this quiet coastal town into a global logistics hub. The port was supposed to open in November 2024, perfectly timed with the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, which Peru would host. It was meant to be a symbol, the moment Peru officially joined the big leagues of Pacific trade. But just months before the grand opening, everything took an unexpected turn. In May 2024, Peru's government, led by President Dina Boluarte, suddenly suspended COSCO's exclusive operating rights. Overnight, the Chinese consortium lost its 30-year right to run the port. The announcement sent shockwaves through Lima, Beijing, and the entire business community. Why? The government said it wanted to ensure transparency and fair competition, arguing that granting Costco full exclusivity violated free market rules. Officials claimed the contract, signed under a previous administration, gave the Chinese too much control over a strategic national asset. But few believed it was just about transparency. The timing was too perfect, and the political winds were shifting. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats had been quietly expressing concern about China's growing footprint in Latin America. Chancay wasn't just another infrastructure project. It was a deep-water port with military potential, built by a company with close ties to the Chinese state. For Washington, this looked less like trade cooperation and more like a strategic foothold for China in the Pacific. Peru suddenly found itself caught in the middle, between its biggest trade partner, China, and its long-standing ally, the United States. So, when the government hit the brakes on Costco's rights, it sent a message. Peru was recalibrating its position. The fallout was immediate. Chinese officials demanded clarification. Costco executives warned that such a move would jeopardize investor confidence in Peru. Local workers feared delays, job losses, and even a full halt to the project. What was supposed to be a triumphant ribbon-cutting had turned into a diplomatic crisis, one that exposed just how fragile the balance of global power had become. On paper, Peru's decision to suspend Costco's operating rights looked like a regulatory adjustment, just a routine review to ensure fairness. But behind the scenes, it was a story of geopolitical pressure, political survival, and a country trying not to pick sides in a global tug-of-war. Let's start with the obvious. Peru relies heavily on both China and the United States. China is its largest trading partner, buying huge volumes of copper, zinc, and other raw materials that fuel Chinese industry. But the U.S. remains a key political ally, aid provider, and security partner in the region. So when Costco's control of Chancay began raising eyebrows in Washington, Lima had a problem. The U.S. government, particularly through the State Department and Southern Command, has long warned Latin American nations about becoming too dependent on Chinese infrastructure projects. They argue that China's Belt and Road investments often come with strings attached, hidden debt, surveillance risks, or even military implications. According to regional analysts, in the months before Peru's decision, U.S. officials quietly met with Peruvian ministers, urging caution over Costco's level of control. The subtext was clear. The U.S. didn't want a Chinese state-backed company running a deep-water port that could potentially host Chinese naval or intelligence assets on the Pacific coast, just 10,000 kilometers away from California. At the same time, Peru's domestic politics were heating up. President Boluarte's approval ratings were low. Protests were growing, and opposition lawmakers accused her of being too friendly with Beijing. By taking a hard line on Chancay, her administration could present itself as defending national sovereignty and show the U.S. that Peru wasn't selling out to China. It was a calculated move, one that might calm Washington and strengthen her political hand at home, even if it meant upsetting Beijing. But there was another layer: economics. Peru's competition regulator, Indecopi, argued that Costco's 60% stake and exclusive management clause created a monopoly risk. In simpler terms, they said one foreign company shouldn't be allowed to control who uses the port or how much they pay. This argument gave the government a legal pretext to step in, even though the same terms had been approved years earlier. So in May 2024, the administration acted. Costco's exclusivity was revoked, pending further review. It was a stunning reversal, but not a final one. Because even as Peru sent a signal to Washington, it couldn't afford to alienate Beijing completely. Billions in investment, trade deals, and future mining exports depended on Chinese cooperation. That's why, just a few months later, the story would take another twist, one that caught nearly everyone by surprise. Beijing did not take the news quietly. Within just a few hours of Peru's announcement, China's foreign ministry issued a carefully worded but unmistakably sharp statement, warning Peru to honor contractual obligations and ensure the legitimate rights of Chinese enterprises. Behind all that diplomatic language, the message was simple. You don't walk away from a $1.3 billion deal without consequences. For Costco, this wasn't just about money. It was about credibility. The Chancay port was one of its biggest overseas investments under the Belt and Road Initiative in South America. If the project failed or if Peru backed out of its commitments, it would send a signal to other countries that BRI projects could be politically undone. That risked discouraging other partners and damaging China's reputation as a reliable builder of global infrastructure. So Beijing turned up the pressure. Chinese diplomats in Lima held closed-door meetings with Peruvian officials. Trade envoys started hinting that future Chinese investments in mining, energy, and technology might be reevaluated depending on how Chancay was handled. Chinese state media began publishing op-eds warning Latin American nations not to politicize economic cooperation. It wasn't an open threat, but the message was crystal clear. Meanwhile, inside Peru, business groups and port unions started voicing concern. They argued that without Costco's leadership, the project could face massive delays, risking the country's chance to become a logistics hub for the Pacific. Shipping companies had already lined up to use Chancay once it was operational. A delay or management dispute could send those routes back to Chile or Ecuador. Even local residents who had protested early construction began to change their tone. Many of them now worked at the port and understood how much their livelihoods depended on it. So, in the months following the suspension, the Boluarte government found itself cornered. On one side, Washington quietly applauding Peru's sovereign review. On the other, Beijing applying subtle but firm diplomatic and economic pressure. And there was a deadline looming, the APEC summit in November 2024, when world leaders, including China's Xi Jinping, were expected to visit Lima. Would Peru really risk hosting APEC while being in an open dispute with the world's second-largest economy? That tension set the stage for what came next, a high-stakes diplomatic dance that turned Chancay from a construction project into a geopolitical bargaining chip. By mid-2024, the situation looked dire. The Chancay port was nearly complete, but operations were frozen in legal limbo. Costco had spent billions, Peru was facing investor backlash, and the APEC summit, where Chancay was supposed to be unveiled, was just months away. Something had to give. So behind closed doors, intense diplomatic negotiations began. According to Peruvian media leaks, Chinese and Peruvian officials met multiple times in Lima and Beijing to find a solution. The stakes were enormous, not just for Costco, but for Peru's global image. After all, what kind of message would it send to investors if a government could cancel a $1.3 billion project right before launch? And quietly, both sides realized they needed each other. For Peru, losing Costco meant more than upsetting Beijing. It meant risking the country's largest infrastructure investment in decades. The Chancay port wasn't just a construction site anymore, it was a symbol of economic ambition. Thousands of jobs, billions in future trade, and the credibility of Peru's business environment were all tied to it. For China, abandoning Chancay would be a major strategic loss. This was the first Chinese-owned deepwater port in South America, a critical piece of its Belt and Road network. It would connect Chinese exports directly to Latin markets and eventually to the Atlantic via rail lines and highways cutting across the Andes. Beijing wasn't walking away. So in August 2024, Peru and China struck a diplomatic compromise. The Peruvian government reaffirmed Costco's role as the operator of the port, but with certain oversight measures to satisfy competition authorities. Costco agreed to greater transparency in pricing and operations, ensuring equal access for other shippers and port users. In practice, this meant Peru could claim it had defended national interests, while China could say its investment was secure. Then came the defining moment. In September 2024, Peru officially restored COSCO's rights to operate the port. The announcement was framed as a clarification rather than a reversal, saving face for both sides. By October, construction resumed at full speed. Crews rushed to finish container yards, dredging, and terminal systems before the APEC summit. And just weeks later, photos surfaced of Peruvian and Chinese diplomats smiling at the site, the port reborn as a symbol of mutual cooperation. The crisis had been narrowly averted, but it revealed something deeper: how fragile global trade projects have become in an era of geopolitical rivalry. Because Chancay wasn't just a Peruvian story anymore. It had become a case study in how geopolitics, diplomacy, and infrastructure now collide in ways no investor or nation can fully control. At first glance, Chancay looks like just another cargo terminal. Cranes, containers, and kilometers of concrete. But in reality, it's much more than that. It's the physical symbol of a shifting world order, one where global trade routes, political loyalties, and economic power are being redrawn right in front of us. Here's why this single port matters so much. First, Chancay changes the map of South American trade. For decades, most Pacific exports from South America had to pass through Chile's Valparaiso or Ecuador's Guayaquil. Chancay gives Peru a shot at becoming the new trade gateway between Latin America and Asia. With its deep-water design, it can handle mega container ships that smaller ports simply can't. That means lower transport costs, faster routes, and potentially billions in savings for regional exporters. Second, it reshapes China's supply chain strategy. Chancay is China's first major deep-water port in the Americas, giving Beijing direct logistical access to South America's rich resources, especially copper, lithium, and agricultural goods. It's part of a broader plan to secure supply chains and reduce reliance on U.S.-controlled trade routes like the Panama Canal. With Chancay, China can bypass choke points and ship directly across the Pacific, a huge strategic advantage. Third, Chancay positions Peru as a middleman in a global rivalry. The port's success could transform the Peruvian economy, but it also places the country squarely in the middle of the U.S.-China competition for influence in Latin America. The U.S. still holds cultural and military sway, but China's economic footprint keeps growing through railways, mines, and now ports. Some analysts even compare Chancay to Djibouti, the African nation where China built its first overseas naval base after initially investing in a commercial port. While there's no evidence of military plans in Peru, the comparison shows how infrastructure can evolve into geopolitical leverage over time. Finally, the port symbolizes a new era of economic multipolarity. No longer is Latin America bound to Western finance or aid. It now has a second major partner willing to build, invest, and compete. And for developing nations like Peru, that competition can be both an opportunity and a risk. It offers leverage, but also demands careful balancing to avoid becoming a pawn in someone else's game. In short, Chancay is not just concrete and cranes. It's a test case, a window into how 21st century power will be built not through wars or sanctions, but through infrastructure, logistics, and influence. And with ships soon to dock and trade flows shifting, this quiet Peruvian town might soon sit at the center of the next global trade revolution. The port of Chancay began as a construction project, but it ended up exposing how deeply geopolitics, economics, and diplomacy now intertwine in the modern world. It's a story about who builds the world's infrastructure, who controls it, and how quickly power can shift when national interests collide. Think about what we just witnessed. A $1.3 billion deal, signed with optimism, nearly fell apart overnight. Not because of engineering failure or corruption, but because of global politics. The same cranes that were supposed to lift containers became symbols of competition between Washington and Beijing. For Peru, the lesson is clear. Neutrality has never been more valuable or more difficult. The country managed to rescue its biggest infrastructure project without burning bridges with either superpower. But it also learned that in today's world, no investment from China, or from the US, is ever just about business. For China, Chancay is both a victory and a warning. It shows how far Beijing's economic reach has spread, yet also how fragile that reach can be when local politics and Western influence push back. The port stands as proof that China's Belt and Road isn't unstoppable. It has to adapt to local realities and international pressure. And for the rest of the world, Chancay is a preview. Around the globe, similar stories are unfolding, from ports in Greece and Sri Lanka to railways in Africa and data cables in the Pacific. Infrastructure is becoming the new battlefield of global influence, fought not with armies, but with cranes, contracts, and shipping lanes. In the end, the Chancay saga is less about one port, and more about the future of globalization itself. The age of single superpower dominance is fading. What's rising in its place is a fragmented, multipolar world, one where every port, pipeline, and trade route becomes part of a grander chessboard. And somewhere along Peru's coast, a brand new harbor is waiting, ready to launch ships across the Pacific, and maybe to signal where the next chapter of global trade begins.